All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Matt Giraud. We're at the Nicholson Library at Linfield University in McMinnville. It's April 4th, 2023. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. And the first question to get you started is why wine?
You start with the big questions.
Exactly.
Maybe one way to answer that is to talk about how I got into wine. I was a Blitz beer drinker and all through college. And after college, at some point, a friend of mine and his partner invited me over to Sunday dinner. And we started to make that a habit. And not because we wanted to, but because we thought we should, I guess we're supposed to have wine, right? So we started drinking some wine, but then we discovered Liner and Elson, which is a wine shop started by Bob Liner and Matt Elson. And what was so amazing about that shop was its totally unpretentious approach to wine. They sold super high-end wines, but they also sold accessible wines, and they were smart about it, and they didn't sort of dumb it down artificially. And so we kind of got sucked up into their thing, and so we got like a $10 bottle of wine, and we thought that was pretty good, and then we're like, oh, $12.50. And so that, part of it, a lot of it was, my introduction was not the way, preceding that, I think I had an association with the wine industry that probably most people have as emblematic of luxury and class and sophistication and education. The wine industry's tried very hard to work on that branding for years, and so that essentially made me not really interested in trying it because that's not who I identify as. So Liner and Elson kind of broke through that and kind of cleared away a lot of that stuff to focus on the thing itself. And so you have two things going on there. Number one is kind of clearing away the bullshit and focusing on like what a wine does and where it can take you. The story that comes in every bottle of wine, of where it was made, who made it, the specific, the details of the weather and the landscape and the culture that all translate into that wine. And Liner and Elson were really good about, kind of getting that, number one. And number two was it became a habit to drink it with these two friends of mine. So there was gathering around a table and the conversation that would come from that. And so, those two things are really essential, anyway, to me, that about why wine is wonderful. And then ultimately, our taste started to get more and more expensive, but there was an upper limit. But we were like, oh, $17.50. And of course, it's gone to be a lot more expensive since then. But that back then, this was in the middle 90s, there's a whole world of wine that you could explore with that budget. And so, we started to pay more and more attention to that. I started to do more thinking about it. And then a job at Willamette Week came up. Willamette Week is an independent newspaper based in Portland, to do a wine column. And so I pitched it with a good friend of mine, James McQuillan, who just passed away recently, but he ultimately became an arts and culture assistant editor at Willamette Week. But at that time, he was just a writer just like me, and so we started a wine column at Willamette Week. And that lasted approximately 95 to just into the millennium. So we were more interested in the people and the stories of wine than in tasting notes. We did do tasting notes, but ultimately, it tastes like cherries. Okay, and so does this one. So does this one. But no, and then you try and get, it's sort of dusty Sicilian cherries. And you're like, okay, but I've never had one of those. Not to say that those aren't important and good, but ultimately it is someone, I don't know, just giving you a sense of what it might taste like. But I think the most important thing about a wine is where it takes you and the connections that it can help you make. I don't need to tell you about how wine is, I don't know about uniquely, but very adept at expressing a specific location and weather set and culture and personal winemaking style. And I also found in the course of doing the column that the people who are drawn to the industry in general are almost always thoughtful people. They love taking this thing that is made in nature and trying to make something expressive and beautiful out of it. And so a lot of the work that we did on the columns was profiles of people. I met a lot of great winemakers, a lot of interesting people. I learned a lot because right at that time I started to make wine myself in my basement with some friends. So the wine column lasted about 5 years, and then the Willamette Week changed direction and cut us loose. But they let me write a last column, which is really nice of them. And so it was really kind of interesting to, it's the dawn of a new millennium, and what does that mean, and what have I learned about wine? And I just regurgitated a bunch of that to you already, but it still held my interest. I wrote a little bit after that, did a piece for Fortune, did some stuff for Northwest Palate. But mostly I went back to work at my main business. I'm a designer and a filmmaker. And so I was doing that during the column too. And towards the end of the column, I decided that I wanted to make first I wanted to make a documentary about why Americans have such a big problem with wine. And so I filmed a trailer, and I've never been in front of a camera. I certainly hadn't really wielded a video camera at all. And I think I think what I was trying to do is sound. That's something that kept coming up in the column quite a bit, was how the wine industry was sort of shooting itself in the foot in terms of, its branding worked really well for a while, and then it started to be a little bit of a drag. And I don't know, you know better than I do the statistics now, and fewer people drinking wine, the people who do drink wine are aging out of the marketplace, and that's, I don't know, a direct result of that sort of built-in classism, in my opinion. But that also, what I thought was really interesting was that that was also, for a lot of Americans back then, and maybe some today, that was also equivalent of non-Americanness. You had beer, that's what Americans drank. You had wine, that's what froofy people who wanted to live somewhere else drank. And I was just really interested in why that was the case. And so that's part of what I wanted to do this series on. And so So I went down to a thing and I pitched it to somebody from HBO, and with my trailer, and the woman I talked to, super nice, kind of a powerful person, as it turns out. She said, "But who would watch that? Nobody really cares about wine." At least not enough to, sell it as a series. And so I went back, but then I had shot enough that, God, I can't remember the chain of events, but in the course of that, I'd spent a year in a couple of vineyards, starting from, darkest January, and this was 1999, and following Brickhouse, Westry, Cameron, those three wineries in particular, and spending a lot of time in Abbey Ridge Vineyard with Bill Wayne. And so I would get up, the best times to film anything are, early in the morning, late at day. That's when the light is nicest. So I would get up really early and take the morning off from my work and go out and just sort of wander around his vineyard. And every now and then I would bump into him and we'd talk. And he's a wonderful, gregarious guy who spends most of his time on his tractor by himself, and so he's very eager to talk with somebody, but he was really such that was one of the most favorite periods of my life, I have to say, just sort of being there, and then through the course of the year, seeing the vineyard evolve, and, feeling like really pretty close to it about how it begins and how it slowly matures. And, feeling the air change and the moisture change and all that stuff. And that was just really potent for me. And then, as it turned out, 1999 was at first going to be a disastrous vintage. And then it turned out to be an amazing vintage. So it's perfect for TV. Couldn't have manufactured it better myself. In 2021, I cut it together.
2021?
Yes, is that right? No, sorry, 2001. Sorry, 2001, thank you.
That sounds more right.
Yeah, that's right. I pitched it to OPB, and they said, "Oh yeah, come on in, let's talk about that." And I was like, "Oh wow, all right." So I was thinking, okay, so I'm just going to be really, generous about this, and I'll let them have it for like $30,000 or something. That'll be great. And so I went in and I talked to the head of programming, and his name I can't remember, but he's there forever, super powerful guy in the industry. And he said, "Okay, yeah, I think we want to do this, so we'll give you $10 a minute." And I went, So for Life of Vine, I made $300 because I didn't know how public broadcasting works. You have to find all the money in advance, and I didn't know anything about that. But it was totally fine because that year, and so they aired it. I can't remember when, in the spring sometime, and it got the best viewership of the night. And then I was able to put it into a feeder network for PBS, the NETA, and it got shown a bunch of places all around the country. And so overall, it was an amazing experience on a number of fronts. Number one, as I mentioned, was just spending the time in that vineyard. With Bill, who just is so in love with that piece of land, and sort of falling in love with it with him, and just following this great story of these people, of those winemakers in particular, who just love what they're doing and want to make the best possible thing they can make, but in a way that was really kind of down to earth. was just just wonderful people. But also, it turned out to be, I paid $300, or I was paid $300 to go to film school. So, in the beginning of that, I was doing my own filming, and, I gradually got better at it. But then later, when it came time to edit it, I would start looking at some of that early footage, and my wife would just hear me yelling at the screen. You're like, focus, come on, give me like a second. But no, I'm like, oh God, it was terrible. So, but gradually, thankfully, I got enough footage over time to sort of wield something together. And, I knew some people in the film industry who donated some of their time. I learned a lot from them. And then towards the, at the end, after it premiered, I got this service so ancient called the carriage service. And basically, it's a report that tells you where your thing is going to air. And it gives you about 2 weeks notice. And so I spent a couple of months just watching those carriage reports, and I saw it was going to be shown in Houston. So I would do the research and find out, if there's any sort of, they weren't called influentials back then, but people, wine industry people or whatever, and any newspapers that might have a wine column. And so I'd send them stuff and a promo video if I could. And so I got interviewed in Houston on air with some morning radio show, and it did really well there. I got a great review in the LA Times. Their wine writer really loved it, and so that did really well there. But it was just kind of neat to sort of mentally travel around the country. Like it's going to be showing in Dayton. Oh, what's Dayton like? So I'd pull up the newspapers. What's going on in Dayton? So I kind of felt like I'd traveled around the country, even though I hadn't. So I had this amazing education from the nuts and bolts of how you film something, to how you edit something together, to how you sell it or don't sell it, to how you market it. So it was just a great experience. So after that, during that time, I had also started to make wine with some friends. Originally, it was James and me. And then it sort of gradually grew into a kind of cooperative. And another thing, sort of another manifestation of the wine thing, is this sort of community building aspect of it. The thing that I've always loved doing is bringing people together to work on a project and make something together. And this turned out to be a perfect thing for that. So we started with just us, and then it was a couple more people that we knew at school, but then they invited some people, and then those people invited some people. So I ended up getting to meet all these people I never would have met before, from fairly diverse set of society, or culture in Portland. And this is going to be our 28th vintage this fall. We've got about 30 people and families, and I'm the winemaker and dishwasher. And some people are into it because they're kind of interested in making wine, but some people just like, there's very stringent requirements that you have to work. We're super careful not to cross any OLCC lines. Everybody has to contribute. Everybody has to work. Everybody has to, put in money and so on. Nobody's paid. So, but at the end of it, we have. We're in fact not this coming weekend, but next weekend we have a bottling. Those are the big things of the year, and everyone is there, and I love making the machine of the logistics, and we fine-tuned everything over the years, and so everybody works, pretty hard for a couple of hours, and then we celebrate. And there is, it's fine to celebrate all the time, but it tastes so much better when you have worked for it and earned it. And so there's a lot of people who just really addicted to that, and I am too. So, and I've learned a lot as a winemaker. I did a harvest with John Groshaw, just a couple of days. Did a harvest at Cameron in a grim 2013 harvest. I worked with Kelly Fox for about 5 years, learned so much from her, and that I've tried to incorporate in the wines that we make. So, and I guess the last sort of wine industry thing that I've done was I was on the board of the IPNC for, I was trying to remember on the way over, 4 years, might be 3, right in the middle of the aughts. And Amy Wesselman was the executive director, still is, I believe, asked me, she's part of Westry, and so we filmed them, but I kind of knew them from school. And, she's wonderful, warm, generous person. And so she wanted to try and shake things up a little bit on the board, to have somebody on the board who wasn't in the industry, or rather in the wine-making industry, just to have a different perspective. So we ended up working pretty closely together on a bunch of different projects, and the funnest one was, I think this is 2005, the focus of the IPNC was Burgundy versus New Zealand versus Oregon. And so I pitched making a little film to introduce it. And just like the carriage service, trying to sell my little documentary all on the country, I got to, talk with people in New Zealand and Burgundy and sort of mentally travel there. So that was fun. And they sent me some of their video. And so we ended up making a piece that it started the weekend. And I don't know if you were around for it, but so it was in the theater here. And I came out in a tuxedo, and I said, well, welcome everybody, glad you're here. So we're going to, we're going to have a little, the theme this year is blah, blah, blah. And then I went, gotta go. And I ran off the stage, film starts, and then it shows me running. And then ultimately I end up in this vineyard with Matt Burson of Portland Wine Company, who's far better actor than me. He was great and I was terrible. But anyway, so we do this thing about wine and how it works, and then I'm intercutting stuff from, I talked to Veronique Drouin, some guys from New Zealand, a couple other Oregon wine industry people, and then we were back in the vineyard with Matt Burson. And I'm supposed to be his waiter, is the idea, his valet. And so ultimately, he tells me to go away. And so it shows me running through the McMinnville campus and then opening the door that everyone had just opened to get into the library. And then I run back on stage. It was brilliant. Never before done. Anyway, people enjoyed it. It was fun to do. So that was like the biggest thing that I did for the IPNC. The next year, we worked on the first sustainability program. So that's in a nutshell.
It's an interesting wine life here in Oregon.
Yes.
I'm going to come back to all of those things, but let's back up for a moment and talk about life before Oregon. Tell us about where you were born and raised and what brought you to Oregon in the first place.
I was born in Rochester. My father was an academic, Rochester, New York. He still is a professor of Sanskrit. So his first teaching gig was in Rochester, New York. I was born there, but we pretty quickly moved to Seattle. I was there until the end of 5th grade. During that time, he spent 15 months in central India with one of the preeminent scholars of Sanskrit. And so I spent a year when I was 5, I turned 5 in India, and I'm told I didn't speak English except to my parents. I just went native, and I've always wondered if it's somewhere in there. I don't remember a word of it, sadly, but so then we came back, and then my father got an even better job at the University of Chicago. That's how we ended up in Hyde Park. So I was there from 6th grade through 12th grade. I was English and journalism was my big thing there. I was on the school newspaper, learned just so much. We had a great teacher there about how to write, and also something about design. One of the seasons that we worked on won a national award. So from there, graduated, and I went. Then I'd always, so it was time to go to college, and I remembered Seattle with such great affection that I really wanted to go back to the Northwest. So I cast a couple of essays out there. I had no idea what I was doing. And somehow I got into Reed. So I went out to Reed, sight unseen, got on the train going across the country, and no fewer than 3 people I bumped into said, "Oh, Reed? Oh, you know that you can still change, you can still transfer." And I was like, what? But it turned out to be great for me, I guess. It was a great education, learned a lot, met some wonderful people, and drank a lot of Blitz beer.
That is the whole Reed experience.
Yes, well, that you can talk about on camera anyway. And I was an English major there. So towards, let's see, at the end of my college career, a friend and I decided that we would start a cafe at Reed. So we did all the work to make that happen. And ultimately, at the end of that first year, we gave it to the student body. And then so right about then, some good friends of mine were thinking about starting an alternative newspaper. And so I joined up with them, and we had an alternative newspaper for 3-ish years called The Free Agent. And I was the managing editor, basically, the one who kept the trains running on time, if you will. And it was a great paper. Our lead reporter was Chris Lidgate, worked for Willamette Week ultimately later. He won us a bunch of awards. He's a great reporter. But the thing that we didn't quite figure out was advertising. So it turns out that's pretty important. And so, you know, I was, towards the end, I was paying my own money to publish it, and it became unsustainable. So ultimately that, but during that time, I had to become the designer of the paper. And then on the strength of that, I basically lied my way into a job as an art director at a tiny little firm. And then ultimately started my own design firm with a good friend of mine as a partner, and we did that for 23 years. At that point, I decided I wanted to do more film, I wanted to have a little more flexibility, and so I left the company, and so I've been freelance ever since. And so what I do mostly is brand strategy and communication strategy, the idea being figure out what it is that someone wants to say, and to who, and to what effect, and figuring out that message and how to articulate that in a way that makes that connection between those two people or those two groups, and then implement that. So then I would also design and build websites, of course, logo work, film work. Sometimes it's messaging, sometimes it's social media. So that's, and here I am today.
With that kind of work, tell me about sort of finding that path and to getting to that specialty eventually. How did that become sort of what you focused on and what was sort of the featured part of your work?
I think I guess it was probably being an English major, thinking about how books communicate what they do. I think it is the idea of communication, and how powerful communication can be, how important good communication is for our world, and figuring out. So it's not a very coherent answer, but you can sort of see how there's messaging strategy is about taking something, some person, some idea, some policy, and figuring out a way to talk about it so that someone else will be interested in hearing it. And yes, that can, at its worst, that can be a bunch of lies, but there's so many reasons, mostly, that someone probably wants to pay attention to. It's more, really, the difficulty is more about how do you clear out all the other crap that people hear all the time. The din of advertising, the din of messaging, on your phone all the time, not paying attention to anything. How do you figure out a way to take someone's important idea and craft it, simplify it without dumbing it down too much, in a way that makes that connection? And you can sort of see that preoccupation in, what I love about wine, that it also makes that connection, kind of. And the Les Garagistes is the name of the winemaking thing that we do. And that's, making these great connections with all these people, one-on-one. I'm always ready to do a project with somebody, to make something with somebody else, because we create this connection between ourselves, and then we physically manifest it in something that we have created. And, those can be big projects and small projects. I've helped a number of friends do electrical wiring. I sort of picked that up as a little fun thing I like to do. So I do some wiring for people, and we live in a time that is pretty scary, I think, where people are just more and more atomized. They're more in their own little silos. That's been exacerbated by social media. It's been exacerbated by phones, and of course exacerbated by the pandemic. And you see that reflected, I'm veering way off course for you here, but you see that reflected in, I was just listening to a podcast by the columnist Ezra Klein about men and boys, not finishing college, not, losing track of stuff and falling behind. And it's just one aspect of it. And, it's so and then there's AI, which sounds great, but that means that even more people will be replaced and out of jobs and atomized into their own little worlds. And I don't think people are built to be that way. They're certainly not happy that way. And that leads, when you are a prisoner of the media that feeds your view of the outside world, that media controls your narrative. And so you can imagine with AI and with, not to get into politics, but the politics coming at you, you're starting to get people who are really out of touch with what it really means to be with other people. And so I could save my soapbox to sort of twist that back into wine. one of the wonderful things about wine is that it can bring people together. It means sitting, at best, it's sitting down at a table and it's eating together. And that's, that has deep communal roots, since the beginning. And to spend that time one-on-one with somebody else or some other people, where you actually get a sense of the three-dimensionality of someone else and the things they believe or don't believe. You have discussions, you have arguments, and you start to flesh people out. And so I think wine can help do that. And so what I kind of want to do with the rest of my career is figure out a way that I can, against all the trends going towards isolation, how can we see each other as people again? And I don't know how we're going to do it, but that just seems like the next great fight. And communication is all about that. Getting people to understand the depth of somebody else.
So you mentioned your kind of preconceptions on wine, which as I think, as you said, are fairly common, I think, among people who grow up around wine or don't know wine very well. As you started going to Liner and Ellison, as you started to discover these wines and enjoying them with company, tell me about what your conceptions were as you started the job at Willamette Week. Where were you in sort of your wine education and sort of wine appreciation path at that point?
I think I'd already been converted. Already drunk the wine Kool-Aid. I think, the thing that was striking to me as I did the column was, when you start to get into the wine world, it becomes your world. And so, but I'd look around and nobody else was, people even close to me weren't paying attention to the wine world like I was. And when they were, they had these great kind of psychological, mostly cultural barriers to enjoying it. It became with all this freight. In America, you are what you buy, and if you bought wine, that's said you thought you were better than everybody else, that you were sophisticated. There was, when I was shooting that trailer that never went anywhere, I did a man on the street interview in Chicago, and this one guy told me, "It's kind of bougie." I was like, well, that kind of sums it up. And so part of what the column was trying to do was get people past that to the things that were closer to the essence of what wine was, at least in my opinion. And so, I at one point, the beer reviewer quit at Willamette Week, and so for 4 months or so, I was also the beer reviewer, which was really fun. And I can tell you, the beer industry people, wine industry people are fun, but beer industry people are just a lot more welcoming, and they're like, "Oh, come and try this," and they're inviting you to do stuff. Nobody, few people in the wine industry ever did that to me, which it's just kind of a different thing. Didn't take it personally, but it was really striking that the sort of cultural personality, it was just, I think because beer is so more ingrained with the sort of perception about what Americans think they are, it's just a lot easier for them to sell their stuff because they didn't have to jump over that barrier. They could go straight to the sell. They didn't have to do the pre-sell. So that's what a lot of the column was about. And this was in the 90s, and this is still an issue today. And I know parts of the industry are trying to figure out a way around that. I sort of think of it as, and my information is not super up to date, But I sort of think of it like golden handcuffs, that the industry, like, still most of its money is from older people. And those are the people who are willing to spend $85 for a bottle of wine. Not to say that in many cases it's not worth it. I mean, Kelly Fox, you know, one of the things that was she just opened my eyes to so much. But one of them was the value of, you know, what goes into an $85 bottle of wine. It's a lot of work, a lot of passion, a lot of time, a lot of expertise, you know, the expense of everything. You know, I joke with Les Garagistes that we have all this equipment that we paid a lot of money for that we use for 1 week a year. It's, you know, it's just a capital intensive, crazy thing. But, you know, those are the golden handcuffs. And I think, you know, it is, how do you market to people who are, I don't know, millennials and younger? And I think those messages, I'll bet the industry think tanks have found, it's hard to do those both because they undercut one another. You can't market to baby boomers that it's about, you know, all the preoccupations with class, but also leisure, and ease, and vistas, and, you know, get millennials interested in it because they don't have that money, they don't have that time, and, you know, they don't want to be boomers. Okay, boomer. But, you know, the marketing for millennials and younger is, you know, stuff like that Underwood is doing, you know, putting in a can, making it just a lot more accessible and a lot less complicated. You know, you do see some advertising that is about, you know, some of it is about like doing it with your friends, but it's, you know, more towards just, it's a buzz vehicle, which it is. But that's kind of like, you can't market those two things at the same time. I think it's really difficult. And so it feels like the industry just can't let go of the one and can't quite embrace the other. And it's super complicated, and I don't envy them that transition. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy. Yeah, it's just, stuff is so damn expensive. You know, I mean, and how do you, you know, I think more importantly, maybe, like some of the advertising does this, it's like getting together with friends. Like, is there a way, there's got to be a way, in fact, somebody hired me, I could find a way, to, you know, pull all the stuff that, at least that I find interesting about wine, that you can travel in every glass. You build this connection with people and cultures from all over the world as you build a connection with the people who are right in front of you. It's this great sort of interwebbing experience. And there's got to be a way that you can do that so that you aren't just dumbing down beverage as a liquor, wine as a liquor. But that has some of that resonance, you know, which I think is really there. So, I don't know, hire me.
You know, one of those like placards with your phone number on it to hold up every once in a while.
I need a sandwich board.
So tell me about those years writing for the wine. Like, obviously, late 90s, interesting time in Oregon wine. Tell me about some of the people you met, some of the stories that captivated you at the time, and what you sort of saw, how you saw the industry evolving in that time.
Yeah. Let's see. So, well, that would have been like 96 or late 95, I think, was our first column. And so I think, well, let's see. What would I say about that? Certainly during that time, I think that was, I want to say, was that when the Evanstads came in? Was it then? And for a lot of people, that was an ominous change. Because, I mean, let's see, the winery industry, well, it's a business. And so, I met so many people who just love doing it. And that was so inspiring to me. But, of course, then they have to turn around and they have to sell it. They have to buy the grapes for the next year. And so, how do you do that in increasingly crowded shelves? I mean, how do you distinguish yourself, especially if you're a small winery? And so you have to get more capital. You just have to build up in some way, and you have to work hard doing it. But there was always a little bit of a grassrootsy thing about the Oregon wine industry. Now, you've got Drouhin came in the late 80s, and that was, as you know, a huge tectonic shift and a vote of approval. And of course, they had money, but I think most people that I knew felt like that was, they came in appropriately. They weren't like flashy, and they weren't, they hadn't made all their money in plastic surgery, and now they're buying a vanity thing. But I think people felt like the Evanstads, I don't know, they built their thing on the top of a hill, and there was this unwritten rule in the wine industry that you leave the tops of the hills, just like in Burgundy. And they're like, yeah, screw that. Or I don't know what they said, but anyway, they did it. So, that was, and of course, more big players have come in since then. I mean, was it the Kendall Jackson or what? I mean, you know better than me how many big players are in there. And, it's a business, and they have the money, and that's good. But I guess the thing that I always found most interesting were the small players who, of course, they had to make money doing it, but they just really loved it. And, Kelly was later, but it's just a great example of someone just consumed by it. Like, it is who she is and what she lives to do. It's just amazing. But so, I met early on, we did a column on John Paul at Cameron Winery, and he's just a fantastic person, and his wife Terry's fantastic, and he's got such a great attitude about wine. It's like, doesn't take any of it seriously except for the wine itself. And I ended up, so just fast forward or digress for a second, I ended up doing, so they did a newsletter every fall, and to sort of get people to come to their open house. And I don't know if you've seen any of them, but they're just hysterical parodies of things. There was some Martha Stewart living, and so John dressed up with a wig, and they wrote copy for this newsletter. It's just really fun stuff. Some of it they would say, maybe it hasn't aged well, but it was funny, certainly funny at the time. And so somewhere in I can't remember, maybe the late aughts, they asked me if I could do a video newsletter. And so we also collaborated, and we came up with this parody of Mondo Vino, if you remember that film. And so we got his son Julian to be this guy who's all about marketing and telling you how to market your winery and forget about this artisanal blah, blah, blah. And he was hysterical. And so we made a little mini documentary there and put it out. And then in the years since, I've done 5, I think, pieces with them. And it's just, they're so fun. And I think their attitude about wine jibes with mine. So anyway, it was great to meet him and sort of be taken up by his passion. Doug Tennell, he's always really generous with his time and his beautiful, rich, mellifluous voice. And you just go, oh, what do you want? I'll do anything. But, one of the early organic grape growers, only ate, vegetarian. I mean, he's kind of an unusual guy back in the day. So it was cool to meet him. And I don't know, I think I met a lot of different people. I remember, well, so, Dick Erath just passed away. And one of my favorite columns was he published a book about
The Boys Up North.
Thank you, The Boys Up North. And so, I thought, okay, I guess I should review this. And so it just seemed a little slick to me. And so I started to dig into it, and I found out that it was ghostwritten by his PR firm. And plus, the PR firm took, just some liberties with, especially vis-a-vis David Lett. Nothing too egregious, but it was like a big vanity project, and he has every right to do it. But so I kind of busted him on that. And he didn't firebomb my car or anything, so it's nice of him. But yeah, I didn't really ever talk to him after that. But thriving industry. The guy who he got to be his winemaker, Rob Stewart, I really loved him, and then he went on to do his own winery, and loved talking with him. He's just such a straightforward, honest, person. It just makes you feel good about people, talking to him. Another favorite source was, what was his name? David Shanane. The redheaded guy.
Peter Rosbach.
Thank you. If ever I needed a snarky anything, he was like my speed dial, because he was ready to say anything. So it was always fun to talk to him. I met Veronique a couple times, such a charming person, really so knowledgeable. So I met a lot of wonderful people, and learned a lot from them. They were gracious to take my calls. I have a wine. And they're like, just. So it was very nice of them. But yeah, I guess I would say, it was just, and also I think too, that year was the high water mark of MADD and the sort of wine prohibition. And, of course, they had very good reason to do all that. But it was interesting because it leaked into of course, it was a direct challenge to the liquor industry. And so there was a lot of jockeying back and forth with, wine prohibition and, how the industry kind of handled that. So I remember we talked about that a little bit. I interviewed Jancis Robinson once, which is really just a super gracious person. And this was like, when we're still, don't drink when you're pregnant at all. And my mother drank martinis and smoked. And maybe it's like I'm case in point why you shouldn't do that. I don't know, but
you might end up at Reed if that happens.
Yes, don't try this at home. But she was pregnant at the time, and I was like, so do you drink? And she said, yeah, I drink moderately. Of course, I have to spit. It's my business. And she said, I find I don't really like the taste, while I'm pregnant. But she was sort of refreshing in her candor about that. Now, no lawyer would let you print anything like that for good reason. You don't want it to be an excuse for people to abuse anything. But it was kind of nice to just give another little perspective to that. And so, that kind of started to wane a little bit towards the end of my column.
So tell me about you mentioned obviously Life and Vine almost kind of as an accident, or as at least not the original intent of the project. Tell me what that taught you about wine that you hadn't already learned. What was it about being in a vineyard and being that close with winemakers for that long that you learned?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one way to say it is the sort of slippery concept of terroir. And I know there are a bunch of definitions out there, and I'm not sure mine is correct, but what I think about is terroir is the sum total of the clone and the vine and how it's tended and the soil it's in and the aspect of the land it is and the microclimate it's on and the vagaries of the weather every year and the training or interest of the winemaker and the people who tend to the vines. It's like this totality of all those things. And some of those overall as sort of a repeated, well, maybe it was said as a bell curve, over time, those start to be constants or kind of constants. The weather does change every year, but it doesn't change that much in a certain area. Winemaker doesn't change that much. And so over time, you get this sort of accreted characteristics of a place. And being there not every day, but once a week for an entire season and, standing there in the rain and listening to the rain fall in the forest and on the vines, and these are bare vines at this point, and plopping on the earth and just sitting there and listening to that and stopping for a moment. Part of the reason why I loved doing that was I got out of the city and I just slowed way down and I paid attention. I spent 8 months paying attention to the world around me. And the vineyard is a manufactured world, so it's kind of that in-between space between nature and, I don't know, a manufacturing plant. But it is sort of interacting with that all the time, and you start to see, bird life, and you hear the wind going through the trees in a certain way, and you see the vines, the sap start to run, and the buds start to break, and how they break, and how they make these little flowers, and then they make the little pistils, and you're just looking at all this and seeing it happening over time. And so that connection with place, I think, is the biggest thing I learned about that. In addition to just fleshing out the kind of personality it takes to make wine. I think you have to be, certainly if you're not coming to it with a lot of money, you have to be pretty stubborn. You have to really believe in what you're doing, and you have to be sort of a certain kind of personality. And usually they're more thoughtful people who want to express something from the natural world. I don't know, it's kind of really vague there. And of course there's other stuff on top of that too. Some of them are like the attention, some of them love the manufacturing process. All these different personalities come into there, but there's like this stubborn philosophy about the importance of the earth and how making a wine not only gives you a window into it, but also helps preserve it. It's this place where people have to slow down and pay attention. So I also learned about that, I guess.
You mentioned that year as being kind of like you said, your film school year of learning the process of film and of. So tell me about the storytelling aspect for you. You spend this time, you meet these people, you see this year in a vineyard and the process. You have all the stuff at the end. So tell me about that process for you of determining how best to tell the story and how it turned out in your perspective now.
Yeah. So I knew I wanted to do, like, just see what happened over the course of a year in a vineyard. And so, as I mentioned, I went out about once a week and filmed and tried to pay attention to what was changing, what was different, and dropping in on winemakers along the way. Where are they in their process? But I didn't really know what I was going to. Originally, I was shooting it just as background for this series that didn't end up going anywhere. But I think I was, just a regular year in a vineyard, tough to sell, especially back then. There's more wine stuff out there now. So it would probably be a little bit easier to sell now. But back then, the HBO woman was right. There's just not any interest in it. And plus, so much of certainly film industry, especially the public industry, is focused, even back then, on getting unheard voices into the mainstream, as it should be. And a rich people hobby thing is just the last on the list there. So if it had been just a normal year, I probably wouldn't be talking to you right now, I guess. But it turned out to have this great cliffhanger dynamic, because it was a late year, and so they're already worried about that pushing harvest back into too late into the fall, and this is before climate change made everything warm again. So they really were like skirting into the rains, and then in early September it started to rain, and they're like, oh my God, they thought, oh, maybe we'll squeeze it out, and it started to rain, which puts back everything, and there's the danger of, if there's too much, it gets up into the grapes, all that other stuff, and mildew, and so on. And so it was like, cliffhanger, nail biter. And then something happened in late September where all those storms gathering out in the Pacific just disappeared. And I think there's a line that Doug Tennell has in the documentary. He says, "We're making wine, baby." We're making. I can't even go to his low. That low.
Look at yourself.
And so it was like cliffhanger and happy ending. So that really helped a lot. And they were just happy. And of course, it ended up being what some people consider one of the best vintages ever in Oregon. So it became the story of that as well. So it was, a lot of it was luck, for sure. But I'm really glad I did it. I learned a lot about shooting. I'm a much better shooter, definitely a much better editor. I'm a better sound person, definitely a better director, and I'm a better storyteller. But I think I'm also, a more, a happier wine drinker, I guess. I just have a better connection to that pace and the kind of people who make it. So, yeah, it was a great experience.
One more question about the experience. You mentioned the after part. You have the product, and now it's being shown, and now you're traveling the world from the comfort of your living room. Tell me about that part of the process for you. What were people excited about or asking you about when you were talking to Houston or Dayton or wherever? What were the kinds of questions, and did they have any concept of an Oregon wine industry at that point?
Yeah. I'm not sure I could speak to that, but I know that the idea of wine, I'm sure I wasn't the first to spend a year in a vineyard, so like and film it or whatever. But for a lot of people, that was the first they'd kind of seen something like that. And And I feel pretty proud that I shot it pretty beautifully. I had 55 hours of footage, and I was lucky to get 24 minutes out of that. But the broken clock is right twice a day, and so I got, thankfully, just enough footage to really tell that story in a way that was really kind of beautiful. And so that kind of made people excited about that. So I think it was more, it was certainly about the Oregon wine industry, but it was also generally about wine, I think, in general. Like when I talked to the Houston people, I did my research and I name dropped their wine region, and boy, did they love that. I still haven't had a chance to have any of their wines, but outside of Austin somewhere, there's actually hills where they make wine. You have this thing that you're just in the middle of it. I've been covering the wine industry. I've been making wine. A lot of winemaking people I know, and then you just take one little step outside, and there's nothing. Nobody knows anything about that. And so it makes you remember that any preoccupation is like that. You get outside of. You're like, everything's about academia, and then you step outside and nobody's paying attention to it, and you're like, wait, why not? So running through a lot of the way Americans think about wine, or they used to anyway, is that it's a class thing. It's about snobbery, and still to this day, I'm talking to somebody about wine, and they go, "Oh, I'm going to be a snob." And what I like to point out is that the pursuit of knowledge about anything is always good. It's only when you weaponize it that it's bad, and that's when it becomes snobbery. So, and that's, beer has plenty of people who are snobs, but plenty of people who aren't. People who are into anything, old cars, camera equipment, whatever, having that knowledge, it's all good. Just as a knowledge of wine. It's just when you use it as a bludgeon, that's when it deserves to be slapped down. But, again, that's sort of, some of that is just baked into 40 or 50 years of marketing in the wine industry. So it's tough to get beyond that.
So I want to talk about your winemaking, but I have sort of one more question about your film. Obviously, you've done a lot since. So take us through some of the projects, some of your maybe favorite projects in the film world that you've done since Life in Vine.
I've done a lot of my film work for public agencies and nonprofits. I co-founded this organization called the Bicycle Transportation Alliance in the early 90s. I named it. It had this really unwieldy name. And so my firm and I did all of its promotion and marketing for 20 years. We donated it. And so I did some film work for that. And along the way, I liked to work every day, part of why I was interested in it. And so I got involved with the bicycle program at the city of Portland, and then we started doing work for them. And so a lot of my career has been in the nonprofit and government worlds. And so I've done a number of things for the Portland Bureau of Transportation. I think my favorite one was, there's this event called Sunday Parkways that was started 15 years ago, something like that. And so they wanted to make a little film to kind of get people excited about it. And so I figured out a way that I could be inside Sunday Parkways and film it by sort of hanging off the back of this electric truck bike. And that was just, it was really fun to shoot everything in motion. I had a little Steadicam thing that I was working. But it's just so amazing, like you're driving along in the frame, and then people are biking along behind you, and everybody's smiling. And it just fills you with warmth. You know, all these different people from all over the city, black, white, Asian, young, old, whatever, everybody's smiling. And you're like, we have a chance after all. And so it was really fun to do. So it's fun to do that. So I made this thing, and a friend of mine told me that she saw it for the first time with some other bicycle advocates, and she said they cried at the end. And I was like, yes. So that's a lot of the work I've done there. I've done some commercial work. And then work for Cameron as well. That's really been fun because we just start with a concept and then take it from there. And some of it happens in the edits, but they're just really funny people, and so it's just wonderful little alchemy. And I look forward to doing it whenever they let me.
So let's talk about the winemaking and Les Garagistes. Yeah. Obviously, you mentioned how it started and how it's grown and how your skill set has grown. So tell me about the wines you're making now and what makes you, I guess, proudest of them, and how far they've come, and maybe anything you've learned in the process of making wine for that long.
So we started in 1995, and we didn't really have access to any real grapes, but we found some at this vineyard up near La Center. So we went up there, and it was this vineyard that this couple had just bought. It was covered with mildew. They really had no idea what they were doing. But she very memorably said, "Oh God, they were living in California, and they saw this vineyard for sale." And she said, "That's so Danielle Steele." And so we made a wine from these grapes. It was awful, like not even we could drink it, but it came from the Danielle Steele vineyard. I did, I'm a designer, so I designed the labels. It's all an elaborate excuse for me to design wine labels. But then we got access. So, we're reading books and trying to figure it out as we go along, asking questions of David Autry and Amy Wesselman, so generous with their time, John Paul sometimes as well. And other industry folks would sometimes give me some advice, and so that was great. But so much of it is about the quality of the grapes you start with, and so it was this terrible marriage of not great grapes and terrible winemakers, and those were dark early years. But somehow we kept doing it, and after a while, we couldn't. After a while, we got some fruit from David and Amy at their Oracle Vineyard, and still it wasn't, and that's good fruit, but we couldn't do it. And so at some point we decided we just can't do Pinot Noir. So we started to go to Eastern Washington, and so most of our wines are from there, and gradually we've ramped up the quality of the vineyards that we work with. And so now we're pulling from this amazing vineyard in Horse Heaven. And we do, so before the pandemic, we did 15 wines a year out of 9 varietals. So obviously some were rosés, some were blends, and so on. And it was like a half-time job for me. But we were always like, we couldn't say no. Sangiovese? Oh yeah, let's try that. Or Mourvèdre, one of my favorites. Gradually, I'm trying to pay attention to the process, not make obvious dumb errors. And gradually our wines get better and better. I redid the labels in the mid-aughts, and now the wonderful thing that people tell me, fairly frequently, is that they'll take one of our wines to a dinner, and they'll go, "Oh, this is some homemade wine," and everyone will go, "Oh, okay, we'll try it," and then they're blown away by how good it is. Now, some of that, start with low expectations, works pretty well, but I did do so at the end of my column. I put a personal ad in Willamette Week to start a wine group, and so I got a wine group of various people from all around the city, and one of those we did Bordeaux's, and we put them all in bags and tasted them. You know about that process. And I put one of our blends in a bag too, and ours won. Now, kind of unfair because American wines they're so different from European wines, and they're more accessible and fruity. So that's sort of a hollow victory, but still, I was proud. But I have to say, it was really like working with Kelly Fox, and I think, I learned some tips and tricks from her, for sure. But I think mostly what I learned from her was the focus and discipline, I guess, of just paying attention at every stage. And that's just made a huge difference. I mean, you can it's super easy to make wine. Just stick the grapes in something and come back a few weeks later and then drink it. I mean, I'm not going to say it's going to be good wine, but it's not that complicated. But to be able to make it express something does require some level of precision and watchfulness and paying attention all through the process, and that is like everyday process, and we didn't do that in the past. So I'm like trying to pay attention every time, every day we bring in new grapes, I'm tasting, I'm seeing how they're feeling, I'm starting to get a sense of what this one always smells like at this point, and is something wrong? And it helps, this is all happening in my basement in Southeast Portland, so that I walk in to my house and I go, something's wrong, and most winemakers have to go, to their winery to see that. That I think. So I think we make a pretty good bottle of wine. So then the pandemic happened, and this is during the lockdown era. It wasn't really clear whether during that harvest whether we'd get locked down and I'd have to make all of these wines myself. And so we cut back to just one wine. And it was so nice. And then I could really pay attention to each. Now this was during the smoky year, so it was like, that was, aside from like the niceness of only have to think about one wine, it was like making wine in post-apocalyptic hellscape. It was unpleasant. There's no camaraderie. We're all wearing masks because of smoke and COVID, and very few of us, so everyone had to do more work to get it. It was just a manufacturing thing. So unpleasant. And since then, we've ramped back up a little bit. And so also, thanks to Kelly, I started to make Pinot Noir again. And I just learned so much from her that I'm able to, I'm never be as good a winemaker as she is, but I'm able to bring out some of that specificity, some of that character in these grapes. And so we also do make Pinot Noir every now and then. But yeah, so, I think to, sum all that up, I don't know how much longer am I going to be able to do that. I'm 60 now, and I like doing it, but it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of lifting and hard labor. It's not that bad, but it is. And, I'm drinking less. There is something like, we make all this wine, but then we have kind of a monoculture. And you're like, well, we make wine because the labor's free. It comes in at about $7.35 with a cork and label in it. And, that's pretty cheap. It's good, cheap drinking. But then you're like, all these other wonderful wines out in the world, you don't really see them. So I kind of miss that. But at the same time, I love getting together and doing this with other people. So I don't know where we'll go from here. We thought about going pro a couple of times. I did all the research into it. And I remember talking with Andrew Rich, who's also given me some great sort of no-nonsense counsel over the years. And I was like, he was like, why do you want to start, real winery? And I was like, it'd be kind of neat to kind of, get it on shelves and in a restaurant. He said, is your ego really that desperate for approval? And I was like, that was like a good sort of, and so that, ultimately I realized that I get to do all the fun parts of wine making and none of the crappy parts of winemaking. And certainly all of the forms and the regulations and all that stuff, don't have to do any of that. But also, some winemakers enjoy the marketing, but I don't have to do any of that either. I don't have to fight for shelf space. I just get to do only the fun thing. And that means that only a handful of people know about the wines I make. But that's all right. I can live with it.
So I know you're not as plugged into the industry and sort of the happenings of it as you once were, but I'm curious from your perspective and from being around it, what are the biggest changes you've sort of seen from the industry that you were kind of embedded in and to now, and what do you sort of see happening next for the Oregon wine industry? What are some things in the future? But it's hard to believe that the industry isn't going to hit a price and population problem. It's just, I know from working with Kelly that for many wineries, what they're charging is actually a reasonable price, though it doesn't seem like it from the outside. Of course, there's plenty of people who can jack it up to those prices because everyone else is doing it, for sure. But either way, if you have a product, I remember Champagne has this problem too. I remember back in the day when I was covering it, if it's only a special occasion beverage, how can you make an industry out of that? And so, again, maybe it's that golden handcuff thing. They can still get people to buy that stuff, but for how much longer? And you've got this accelerating thing of cost of labor, the cost of land, the cost of marketing, that make things just more and more expensive, especially for a smaller a region of, there's some big wineries, but also lots of smaller wineries that have the economy of scale. And so that's something's going to have to come to a head. Some people are going to have to, I don't know, go out of business, and that would be a shame. So I don't know, that just seems like that's kind of inevitable, and I hope somebody's thinking about and planning for it. And I also, ultimately that the cultural generational shift, I hope somebody's trying to figure that out now too, or the wine industry's screwed. I remember, I think
I'm not sure if Sokol Blosser would agree with this, but when they released their Evolution series, it was like this, it might be different now, what I remember was sort of like this sweet, easy drinking wine. And I didn't really care for it, but I thought they were smart to kind of start to make something a little more accessible to first-time wine drinkers. And you know, I don't know what it costs now, but it was a reasonable price point too. So I thought that was super smart of them. And, you know, so maybe every winery, even small ones, they have a range of price points for sure. But like some of them, they're still $35 and up. And how do you know, so much of the wine industry is a hand sell. You know, because wine industry can't afford to market an overall sustained branding campaign. And so much of it is developing a personal connection with a specific winery. And that's all, just so much of it is done by hand. You get people to come out to your winery, meet them in wine shops, get people excited about your story, so it isn't just like Pinot Noir A, Pinot Noir B, Pinot Noir C, what's the difference? It's like, oh, that one has a story, and I like those people, and I like what they're doing, and they share my values, or I really, you know, I love their place, whatever, you make some sort of connection, but that's like all like, you know, in the trenches work, because, you know, nobody can do like big blast advertising like the beer industry can do. So how do you make that connection with, you know, wine drinkers potentially coming into the market who don't have that kind of money? You know, how do you do that? And maybe it is, you've got sort of bridge, you know, maybe Underwood is like that. My goddaughter, she's 21, and I came over to dinner with her and her parents, and she was drinking Underwood. And I was like, okay, that's a start. Good for you. And I'm not saying Underwood's bad, but it's like super accessible, and it doesn't have the ooh kind of thing about it. And so maybe it's, you know, just making sure that the whole industry has this sort of tier where you've got like enough stuff in each area to lure people upwards. But still, I don't know, $35, a lot of money. I think it is, you know, one of the things that I kind of remember wondering if it was happening while I was doing the column, and certainly since, is I love the spirit of the people who got into the industry and did it by their own bootstraps. You know, they started in the corner, well, they started like working a harvest, and then they started like helping out in the cellar, and then maybe they became an assistant winemaker, and they made some wine in a corner so they could have the bonding. And, you know, and like that is sort of this test to me of someone who just simply loves it. And, you know, it's just how much money it takes to get in the industry these days. I wonder if, you know, it's just harder and harder to be that kind of winemaker. I know people still do it, but it must be so forbidding. And then, you know, let's say you're able to do it. God, where do you sell it? Like, how do you get shelf space? How do you get restaurant space? It's tough. And so I really hope that part of the industry can be supported somehow. I think it's still there, but it's just the economics must be just more and more forbidding about that. Yeah.
All right, last question for you is, what comes next for you? What's on your horizon that you're looking forward to? Projects in wine or outside?
I'm about to go to Portugal for a month with my girlfriend, and it will be the first time I've been away from work for 30 days. since college probably. And so, you know, I'm 60, my work life is starting to, you know, I'm getting there. And so this is it's kind of a natural bridge for me. What do I do next? And it's going to be important that I find another way to my self-identity is not anchored in work anymore, because once I don't have work, I'm SOL. I'm just staying on the phone all the time. So I'm hoping that this, you know, this vast journey that we're going to do, it's going to be so awesome, is going to just clean out all the jets. You know, I'm trying to learn Portuguese, which, gotta say, is fucked up language, but also wonderful too. And I'm just looking forward to, like, if I can just communicate with, again, that's the communication piece. Like, can I communicate with, you know, by all accounts, wonderful people, and we'll visit a couple of the wine regions and hopefully get to talk to some winemakers. I always love doing that and learning what they're doing and what they're thinking about. And then probably, I think what I'm thinking about doing is writing a book about home winemaking that's really about more than home winemaking. It's about, you know, getting people together and making something. Again, it's that preoccupation I mentioned a long time ago, which is, what can I do in my super tiny way to remind people that people are worth knowing and spending time with, and working together is the only way we're going to survive. And I hope we still make wine. I love, you know, I driving out as fall begins out the gorge, first thing in the morning, sun rising into your eyes. It's this wonderful ritual. We bring back the grapes. I somehow back it up the driveway, try not to scrape my neighbor's house. And then there are people there, and a bunch of these people have been doing it for long enough. Everybody already knows what to do. So we're this great team, and we have people already getting in the bins, pulling out leaves, and I'm tasting it and trying to think about a whole cluster or not or whatever. We're setting up the destemmer, and we have somebody rigged a chute down into my basement. So we set that up, and it goes down into the basement, and people are down at the bottom picking out the pips and any other leaves and stuff like that, and everyone has a job. We're doing this together, and then we finish it, we clean it all up, and we drink and eat. And we do that every harvest and every bottling. And I don't know, I can't imagine what could be better than that, really. Got to know some of the wineries or some of the vineyards out there and the people. It's a great life, really. And you know, even with grape prices going up and up, if you don't have to pay for labor, it's still pretty cheap. So, I don't know, I guess that's, who knows what's next for me? Maybe I'll just stay in Portugal.
You can make wine there.
Could, yeah, indeed.
Well, that's all the questions that I have for
Okay.
you. Thank you so much for your time today, for sharing your stories with us and sharing some good humor with us today. Appreciate you coming out, and I will let you off the hook.
All right, thanks for your time.